The rain came down in thin, cold needles that October Sunday, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder but just appeared, gray and relentless, turning the mountain road through Whitmore Pass into something treacherous between one blink and the next. Daniel Carter had been awake since 2 in the morning. He worked the overnight shift at a commercial construction site 40 minutes outside Maple Ridge, framing condominiums that were eating up the valley's eastern edge. He drove carefully. The road was narrow and the guardrails were old, more suggestion than barrier. Mist hung between the pines in dense, unmoving curtains. Sophie would be awake by now. She always woke early on Sundays and climbed into his bed if he wasn't home yet, pulling his pillow against her chest until he returned. His neighbor, Mrs. Gallagher, stayed overnight on his long shifts. She was 72 and reliable in the way that mattered. She was there. He was thinking about pancakes. Sophie liked them with sliced bananas and a measured amount of syrup. Not too much, she would instruct him, with the gravity of a 6-year-old who had opinions about sweetness. The turn came up fast, a long, sweeping curve where the road hugged the hillside above a shallow ravine. Daniel slowed instinctively. That was when he saw the SUV. It had gone off the road about 50 yards ahead, not over the ravine, which would have been fatal, but sideways into the embankment. Nose pointed downhill, the passenger side crumpled against a thicket of scrub pine. Black, expensive-looking, resting on its passenger side doors so the driver's side faced up at the sky like an open wound. Steam rose from under the hood. One wiper still dragged across a shattered windshield. Daniel stopped his truck. He sat for a moment in the warmth and considered. He could keep driving. He was tired. 20 minutes from home. The accident had just happened, and it was possible someone else would come along. He looked at the dashboard. A photo tucked into the corner of the plastic Sophie at the county fair the previous summer, holding a paper cone of pink cotton candy with both hands, laughing at something outside the frame. Daniel turned off the engine and got out into the rain. The cold hit him first, then the silence. No traffic, no voices, just rain and the soft creak of cooling metal. He slid down the wet embankment and reached the SUV's undercarriage. Up close, the damage was worse. Passenger windows gone entirely. The frame buckled, the sharp chemical smell of deployed airbags. He pulled himself up to the driver's door and wrenched it open. A woman hung suspended inside, held by her seatbelt at an awkward angle, head slumped forward. Mid-40s, dark hair plastered to her face. A cut above her right eye bled in a thin, steady line down her cheek and dripped from her jaw. A charcoal blazer over a white shirt, both soaked through. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse weak, irregular. But there. Her lips had a faint, bluish tint. Her chest wasn't moving. He pulled his pocket knife and cut the seatbelt. She dropped into his arms, heavier than he expected, and he nearly lost his footing on the wet pine needles. He hauled her up the embankment and laid her on the gravel shoulder. He started compressions. 30 fast, measured pushes to the center of her chest, counting in his head. Rain ran into his eyes and he blinked it away. 2 rescue breaths. 30 more compressions. He had done a first aid course 4 years ago when Sophie was born, had half convinced himself he'd forgotten everything, but his hands seemed to remember. On the second cycle, she coughed, a thin, wet sound, more a shudder than a cough, but there. He turned her onto her side, and she pulled in one raw, shaking breath, then another. He got her into the truck cab and cranked the heat, found his work jacket in the back seat and pulled it over her shoulders. Then he put the truck in gear. He made it 4 miles. The engine had been running rough for weeks, a problem with the fuel pump he'd been managing by keeping the tank above a quarter full. He'd been planning to fix it at the end of the month. He hadn't filled the tank before the overnight shift. The truck coughed twice and died on a downhill stretch between 2 tree lines, rolling to a stop at the edge of a soft shoulder. Daniel tried to start it again. The engine turned over without catching. He tried 3 more times and stopped, because he knew the sound. It wasn't going to start. He checked his phone. No signal. The pass was notorious for dead zones. The woman's phone was in her blazer pocket. Same result. She was drifting in and out. Not unconscious exactly, but not present. Her eyes opened occasionally and she said something once that he couldn't make out. The cut on her forehead had slowed but hadn't stopped. The bluish tint was returning to her lips. He had to think. It was 5 miles to the valley floor on foot in this weather. He knew these woods. He'd hunted up here with his father from the time he was 12, and there was a cabin about 1.5 miles east through the tree line. His father's cabin. He still paid the property tax on it. He couldn't wait for a car to come. The road didn't see much traffic on Sunday mornings. "I need you to walk with me," he said. "Just a little. Can you do that?" She didn't answer, but her legs held when he steadied her. "That's enough," Daniel said. "Come on." He led her into the trees. The forest was dense and wet, and the ground was uncertain, exposed roots, soft spots. Last year's leaves turned to dark mulch that shifted underfoot. Daniel picked his way by memory and instinct, checking his compass on his phone before the battery died at the half-mile mark. After that, he went by the shape of the ridge and the direction of the stream he could hear but not see. She fell twice. Both times he caught her, and both times her hand gripped his jacket sleeve when he steadied her, some part of her still reaching, still engaged. The cabin appeared between the pines as a dark shape against the darker forest. The porch boards still held. He found the spare key under the same flat stone it had always been under. Inside, cold, close, smelling of dust and old cedar. He guided her to the iron bed and lowered her onto the mattress, found the emergency blanket in the drawer below the stove, and covered her. He built a fire, his hands shaking with cold, clumsy with the kindling, and the flames caught on the third attempt. Then he sat back and looked at her. She had stopped breathing again. Her chest simply wasn't moving. Daniel crossed the room and started compressions, kneeling on the wooden floor beside the bed. He counted aloud this time, his voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with how he felt. 30. 2 breaths. 30 more. On the third cycle, she gasped and grabbed his wrist. Her eyes opened dark gray, fully focused in a way they hadn't been until now. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at him. The grip on his wrist didn't loosen. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice was rough, as though she hadn't used it in a long time. "Safe," Daniel said. "A cabin. You're going to be all right." She let go of his wrist and closed her eyes, but her chest kept moving, up and down, slow and steady. Daniel sat on the floor with his back against the bed frame and didn't move for a long time. The fire had been going for an hour when she spoke again. She said her name without him asking, as if she needed to hear it herself. Victoria Hale. Daniel was at the small wooden table, inventorying supplies: 4 cans of soup, a bag of rice, a first aid kit, missing most of its contents, but still carrying gauze and antiseptic. He had cleaned the cut on her forehead. It wasn't deep enough for stitches. He stopped when she said the name. Victoria Hale was not common. It was on the proposal that had circulated through the Maple Ridge Town Council for 18 months, the Hale Development Group's plan to purchase the eastern residential parcels along Creek Road, rezone them as mixed commercial, and build a retail and hospitality complex. The proposal had been voted down twice and resubmitted with modifications twice. A final vote was scheduled for November. The Carter family had owned a house on Creek Road since 1987. "You're the one trying to buy Creek Road," he said. "I was on my way to a planning meeting," she said. "A revised proposal. I was supposed to be there by 9. A silence settled between them. It had weight. "Why didn't you leave me on the road?" she asked. Direct, without self-pity. "I couldn't live with having left you there," he said. "That's the whole answer." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, "My company has a legal team and a reputation for leverage. I want you to know that's not what this is." "I wasn't going to ask." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." Neither of them spoke again for a while. The fire held. The rain continued. The cabin was, in spite of everything, warm. By nightfall, the temperature outside had dropped into the low 30s, and the cabin's walls weren't well insulated. The fire held, but its warmth died about 8 feet from the stove in every direction. The window above the bed had a gap along its lower sill where the wood had warped, and through it came a thin, persistent draft that smelled of pine and wet earth. Daniel found one wool blanket in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, his father's dense, dark plaid that smelled of cedar and something older. He'd been sitting on the floor, keeping watch, feeding the stove at intervals, not wanting to crowd the space. By 9 o'clock he was shivering. "You should get on the bed," Victoria said. She had been watching him with the careful attention of someone who was accustomed to assessing situations, even when she was the least capable person in them. "You're shaking. That's the beginning of hypothermia, and I'd rather not require rescuing twice in one day." He sat on the edge of the bed because she was right. She moved to give him room, wincing with the effort. They sat side by side under the emergency blanket and the wool plaid, and the warmth between two people in a small space began to do its slow, impersonal work. She asked about his daughter. He told her about Sophie the way you tell a stranger things, when the normal social structures have been suspended by necessity, and the night is long, and the fire makes everything both smaller and more honest. Sophie's habit of naming her stuffed animals after historical figures she heard about at school. Eleanor Roosevelt was the rabbit. Thomas Edison was the bear. And when Daniel had asked why Edison, she had said, without missing a beat, because he's fuzzy and important. Sophie's insistence on pancakes on Sunday mornings with exactly the right amount of syrup. The way she sang songs to herself while doing puzzles. Songs she made up that had no particular tune and were mostly a description of what was in front of her. He talked carefully around the absence at the center of it until Victoria asked directly, "Sophie's mother?" "She died," Daniel said. 18 months after Sophie was born. Cardiac arrhythmia. She was 29. "I'm sorry. Thank you." He meant the simple version, not the extended one that people sometimes gave because they didn't know how else to fill the space. She was quiet for a moment. Then she talked about herself, not the polished version with the correct trajectory, but the version that came out in the small hours of unusual nights. She said she had been on this road because she preferred driving herself on difficult trips, had, since her 20s, it gave her the illusion of control, she said, then amended. Maybe not an illusion, maybe just control. She preferred having her hands on the wheel. She said her company had been expanding aggressively for 7 years. That the Maple Ridge project was one of 11 active development proposals, and that she had been personally reviewing 3 of them in the past 6 months because something had been nagging at her about the direction. The project would displace 40 households, Daniel said. "Yes," she said. "I know." "You read the proposal?" she said. 3 times, he confirmed. The fire shifted, a log collapsing softly into coals. She looked at the ceiling with an expression he couldn't easily read. Not distress. Not the managed neutrality of someone in a negotiation. Something more complicated than either. "I've been doing this for 15 years, she said. "I know what the net benefit projections show, and I know what they leave out. I know how to build a case for almost any decision, and I'm good at it." She stopped. "I was on my way to the meeting because I hadn't decided yet. I kept thinking one more look at the numbers would resolve it." "What were you going to decide?" "I don't know," she said. "Ask me in the morning." They slept, eventually, in the way of people who are exhausted enough that circumstance overrides everything else. The fire burned low and held. He woke at 4 to the sound of the fire dying and found her already awake, sitting with the wool blanket around her shoulders, looking out the small window above the bed at the darkness between the trees. The rain had stopped at some point while he slept. The silence was total in the way of deep woods after weather. Every sound absorbed by wet pine and earth. The window glass had condensation on it, and the shapes beyond were dark and still. He got up and fed the last of the firewood into the stove, banking it carefully, and the flames caught and brightened the room by a degree that felt significant given how dark it had been. "I have a mild concussion," she said, without turning. "I should have told you sooner. You should have. You couldn't have done anything differently. And I needed to sleep." She turned to look at him then. In the recovering light, her face looked less like the photograph on the corporate proposals and more like a person who had been frightened and was not quite done being frightened. "I want to tell you something before we're out of here, and I turn back into whoever I am out there." He waited. "I came up this road today because I've been trying to talk myself back into something I'd already decided was wrong," she said. "The Maple Ridge Project. I have 38 years of learned momentum around a certain way of making decisions, and it's hard to stop that momentum even after you've realized you should. It's almost always easier to keep going." Daniel was quiet. "The meeting this morning, it was going to be me telling the council we were proceeding. I'd written the talking points, sent them to my assistant the night before, set an alarm." She stopped. "And then my car went off the road and a stranger resuscitated me twice and brought me through a forest to a cabin that belongs to someone's memory of their father. And in this cabin, in the cold, I found it very difficult to keep pretending the easier thing was the right thing." "Is that what you were doing?" he asked. "Pretending? Yes," she said. "I think so. For long enough that it had started to feel like believing." He sat on the edge of the bed. The room was warmer now. Outside, the first thin edge of gray was beginning to separate the trees from the sky. "Will your board let you pull out?" "Not easily," she said. "But that's my problem, not yours. Why do it when it's that hard?" She thought seriously, as if the question deserved a serious answer. "Because easy and right are different things," she said. "I've known that for a long time. I've just been pretending otherwise." A bird called once in the forest, the first bird, the one that goes before the others, testing the quiet. They both heard it. Neither of them spoke. There was a moment in the growing light when the distance between them was smaller than geography alone could explain. He didn't move toward her, and she didn't move toward him. But something shifted in the silence, became less the silence of strangers and more the silence of people who had understood something together that they hadn't yet put into words. "The rain stopped," he said. "Yes," she said. "We should try for the road at first light." "Yes," she said. And then, quietly, "Thank you, Daniel." He nodded once. The fire held. They left the cabin as the sky turned the pale, washed-out blue of early morning, the trees still dripping, the ground silent underfoot. Victoria moved better than she had the night before. The concussion would need proper evaluation, she acknowledged. And she held her balance carefully on the uneven ground, but she was present in a way she hadn't been. Daniel had found an old pair of his father's work boots in the cabinet by the door, too large for her but serviceable, and she'd pulled them on over her ruined stockings without comment. It took 35 minutes to reach the road. A county maintenance truck came around the curve 20 minutes after that, and by the time they reached the valley floor, there were 2 sheriff's vehicles waiting, and behind them a dark sedan with a man in it, who identified himself as Victoria's head of security and looked like he had been awake for some time. The hospital was 20 minutes away. Victoria refused the stretcher and walked in on her own. Daniel sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before a nurse told him Miss Hale had a mild concussion and 2 cracked ribs and would be held overnight for observation, and that he was free to go. He went. Sophie was in Mrs. Gallagher's kitchen eating toast when he walked through the door. She looked up and said, with the uncanny accuracy of children who know their parents, "What happened to your face, Dad?" He sat down at the kitchen table. He had a scrape on his cheekbone he hadn't noticed and mud in his hair, and he was still wearing damp clothes that smelled of pine and smoke and old wool. "Long night," he said. Sophie put half her toast on his plate without being asked. He ate it. He didn't know, sitting there in the warm kitchen with his daughter's hand occasionally pressing his arm to make sure he was real, that the story wasn't finished. He didn't know about the phone call that would come 11 days later, or the quiet withdrawal of the Maple Ridge proposal from the November Council agenda, announced in a brief company statement as a strategic reallocation of development resources. He just ate the toast and let Sophie tell him about what she'd watched on television. The call came on a Wednesday, 11 days after the accident. He recognized the area code as unfamiliar and almost didn't answer, but he was on a lunch break at the site and he picked it up. "It's Victoria Hale," she said. "I'm not calling about anything official. I wanted to check that you were all right." He was all right. He told her so. She said she was largely also all right. Ribs would take 6 weeks. The concussion had resolved. She was working from her apartment and finding it. She said with a particular flatness, quieter than she was used to. They talked for 20 minutes. Tentative, the way of people who have a shared reference point that doesn't fit any normal category and aren't sure what it entitles them to. She asked about the truck. He told her about the fuel pump, finally fixed. She said she was glad. He believed her. She called again the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. By December, it had become a habit neither of them had decided to form. The calls lasted longer each week. Began with the formality of two people who had met in unusual circumstances and moved gradually into something less careful. She talked about the board's response to the withdrawal of the Maple Ridge proposal. 3 members had called for a formal review of her leadership decisions, and the legal team had been deployed, briefly and unsuccessfully, to argue that the withdrawal was a breach of fiduciary duty. She had sat through 2 days of meetings that were, by any reasonable measure, designed to exhaust her into reversing course. She had not reversed course. He told her about the school play Sophie was in, a dramatization of the water cycle in which Sophie played a raindrop. She had 2 lines. She had memorized both of them so thoroughly she sometimes delivered them in her sleep, addressing her pillow with complete conviction about the process of evaporation. Victoria laughed at this, a real laugh. The unmanaged kind, and it changed something between them that had been close to changing for several weeks. In January, she came to Maple Ridge. Not for business, there was no outstanding business anymore, but because she said she wanted to see it clearly, not through the lens of a site assessment. He offered to show her around, feeling the improbability of this and deciding to do it anyway. She arrived on a Saturday morning in a car she drove herself, wearing jeans and a gray wool coat, looking in an unguarded way like someone who was slightly unsure what came next. They had coffee at the diner on Main Street booth by the window. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Harold Finch, who had been there since Daniel was a child, refilling their cups without being asked. Then they walked Creek Road, which was bare-treed and frost-hardened, and looked very different from the way it appeared on a development proposal. She stopped in front of his house, the small craftsman bungalow with the porch he'd repaired 2 summers ago, and the maple tree whose roots were doing incremental damage to the front walk. "It's a good house," she said. "Needs a new water heater," he said. "Every house needs a new water heater," she said. "That's what houses are." Sophie's soccer game was that afternoon. At the concession stand, she told Victoria about Eleanor Roosevelt, the rabbit, and Thomas Edison, the bear, in full, careful detail, occasionally testing whether Victoria was actually listening by repeating a fact she had already stated. Victoria passed the test. Driving home, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat within 4 minutes, as she always did after soccer. Daniel drove. Victoria looked out the window at the bare winter fields. "She's remarkable," Victoria said. "I know," Daniel said. They drove in silence. But it was the other kind of silence, now the kind that didn't need filling. October came around again. The maples went first, then the birches, the hillsides cycling through orange and gold, and the particular shade of dark red that appeared for about a week in mid-October and never lasted. The mountain road was dry this year. The guardrails had been replaced in the spring. Daniel had noticed them when he'd driven up to check on the cabin in June, and had been glad in a way that was difficult to articulate some reckoning the county had made with its own neglect. He'd spent 3 weekends that summer doing repair work. new boards on the front porch, fresh chinking between the logs on the north wall, a proper latch on the door. He worked there alone on those Saturdays, between himself and whatever he still owed his father's memory, and didn't tell anyone he was doing it. The work itself was the point. The cabin that had been slowly returning to the forest was now, instead, becoming something that might outlast him. Victoria had moved to Maple Ridge in March. She'd spent 2 months looking at properties, consulted with a local architect named Claire Osgood, who had grown up in Maple Ridge and had strong, specific opinions about building in a place you understood, about a parcel on the south side of town that had been sitting undeveloped for years. She put in an offer, 3 acres on a gentle slope with good drainage and a view of the ridge. The project she was developing now was smaller than anything her former company would have considered 16 units of workforce housing, priced at cost, built to a standard Claire kept describing as permanent and honest. The investors she'd found were patient capital, not the kind that needed a return by next quarter. The board of her former company had not understood any of this. That was no longer her problem to solve. She and Daniel had not moved in together, not yet. They had arrived at something more honest than urgency, a recognition that the thing between them was real and therefore deserving of patience. That some things were made more solid, not less, by being given time. Sophie had graduated from her initial, serious assessment of Victoria to a comfortable familiarity that expressed itself as Sophie telling Victoria her soup needed more salt, or that Eleanor Roosevelt, the rabbit, had selected Victoria as a preferred holder, and Sophie was fine with this if Victoria was. Victoria was entirely fine with this. On a Saturday in mid-October, Daniel drove Victoria up the mountain road. Sophie was at a birthday party until 4. The trees were at peak color, the maples doing their annual impossible performance, and the trail to the cabin was carpeted in fallen leaves. "You fixed it," Victoria said, when the cabin came into view. "Needed doing." She walked up the porch steps and ran her hand along the new railing. He unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and fresh wood and the faint trace of last winter's fires. He'd put a new mattress on the bed. There was a jar of dried wildflowers on the table. She looked around slowly at the wood stove, at the window above the bed, at all the particular geography of the place where they had, without planning it, started. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When I said that night that I wanted to change things, I wasn't sure whether I meant the company decisions or something else. I thought it was just the company decisions." She stopped. "I was wrong about that." He looked at her. "I think I've been building things in the wrong direction for a long time," she said. "Not abstractly wrong, wrong in the sense that I kept building away from the places where I actually wanted to be." She paused. "I want to be here. With these people." He crossed the room and took her hands. She always ran cold. She looked up at him with the gray eyes he had first seen in firelight, when she was half-conscious and frightened and entirely herself. "Stay," he said. It wasn't an elaborate thing to say. It was the most accurate thing he knew. She said yes. They drove back down in the late afternoon light. Sophie was waiting on the front porch, still in her party clothes, holding Eleanor Roosevelt the rabbit. "Mrs. Morrison says autumn is the best time for new things," Sophie announced as they came up the walk. "Does she?" Daniel said. "She says everything that looks like an ending is actually a beginning in a different color." Victoria caught Daniel's eye over Sophie's head. He saw her smile, the real one, the one he had been watching for and finding with increasing regularity. "Mrs. Morrison sounds wise," Victoria said. "She's 6, Sophie said with perfect seriousness. "But she's very smart." They went inside. The maple tree in the front yard went on doing what maples did in October, burning through its color at its own pace, indifferent to the particular happiness of the people moving around below it, lit from within by something that had no word other than the season's own name. It would drop its leaves by the end of the month, stand bare through November and December, and the long cold of January, and then in April it would begin again. Green and tentative and entirely certain, the way things that have endured tend to be.